The CEO, hiding his identity to work at the company, falls in love at first sight with a junior clerk. After learning the truth, she left her job, and the story's ending is unbelievable. Hi, my beautiful reader, and welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin, let's take a moment to reflect. Dear Heavenly Father, I entrust my dear reader into your loving care. Protect them, guide them, and fill their hearts with peace and joy. Amen. Your heartfelt responses to our last story truly moved me. Each comment reminded me how blessed I am to have a family like you, a family more precious than any treasure. Your kindness and love inspire me every day. Now, I want to share something with you. Many of you already know this, but for our new family members, we upload stories twice a day, at 11 a.m. and 7 p.m. GMT. So, no matter where you are in the world, you can always join us for a new chapter of inspiration and connection. Tell me, how did the last story make you feel? Did it touch your heart as your words touch mine? Let's begin a new chapter together. A story of love, destiny, and the beauty of life's unexpected moments. I can't wait to share it with you. The Chicago skyline sparkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dan Christian's penthouse suite, each glittering light a testament to the dreams of those working late into the night. At 32, he stood at the pinnacle of success, yet felt further from reality than ever before. His reflection stared back at him from the polished glass, sharp jawline, steel blue eyes, and a carefully maintained appearance that screamed power to everyone who saw him. But tonight something was different. Tonight the mask felt heavier than ever. The soft hum of his home automation system filled the silence as he loosened his Italian silk tie. Another board meeting had ended with unanimous approval of his proposals. Another day of people scrambling to agree with every word that left his lips. Dan ran his fingers through his dark hair, messing up the perfect style his personal groomer had crafted that morning. What was the point of being right if no one dared to tell you when you were wrong? His phone buzzed. Another message from his executive assistant about tomorrow's merger discussions. Dan ignored it, walking instead to the vintage record player in the corner of his living room. His fingers traced the familiar edges of his father's old jazz collection, finally selecting a worn Miles Davis album. The melancholic notes of Blue in Green filled the vast space of his penthouse, echoing off marble floors and minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's annual salary. 20 years ago, he had been Dan Christian, the scholarship kid with worn-out shoes and big dreams. Now he was Daniel J. Christian, CEO of Morrison Technologies, the wunderkind who transformed a failing software company into a tech empire. The papers called him brilliant, ruthless, enigmatic. His employees called him Mr. Christian, their voices always carrying that slight tremor of fear mixed with admiration. When was the last time someone had simply called him Dan? He moved to his home office, the space dominated by a massive desk made from reclaimed wood, an attempted connection to authenticity in a world of glass and steel. The wall of monitors displayed various metrics: stock prices, project timelines, employee productivity rates. Numbers, always numbers, but lately they'd begun to feel like chains rather than indicators of success. Opening his laptop, Dan pulled up the employee database. Morrison Technologies employed over 10,000 people across its global offices, but his eyes focused on the Chicago headquarters roster. Every profile contained the same staged smiles, the same carefully crafted professional summaries. He thought of the lunch hour he'd spent in the lobby earlier that week, disguised in casual clothes, watching his employees hurry past. The conversations he'd overheard had been revelatory. Complaints about project deadlines, whispered discussions about office politics, genuine laughter over shared jokes. That's when the idea had first taken root. Dan opened a new document and began to type. James Morrison, a fitting pseudonym borrowing the company's name itself. Background: bachelor's degree in computer science from a mid-tier university, 5 years of unremarkable experience at smaller tech firms. Nothing outstanding enough to draw attention, nothing so mediocre as to raise suspicions. He crafted an entire digital footprint with the help of his most trusted IT security expert, the only person who would know his true identity. The clock struck midnight as Dan finalized the details of his plan. Tomorrow, James Morrison would join Morrison Technologies as a junior software developer, assigned to a mid-level project team. No special treatment, no shortcuts. For the first time in years, Dan Christian would have to earn every scrap of respect based solely on his abilities and character. He walked to his closet, larger than some apartments, and pushed past the rows of bespoke suits to the far corner. There hung the clothes he'd carefully selected: off-the-rack jeans, plain button-down shirts, scuffed dress shoes. A far cry from his usual wardrobe, but that was exactly the point. He'd even purchased a pair of fake glasses, subtle enough to alter his appearance without drawing attention. The bathroom counter held more evidence of his preparation: hair dye that would turn his dark brown hair to a lighter shade, colored contacts to change his distinctive blue eyes to a more common brown. Small changes, but combined with a slight slouch and different speech patterns, they would render him unrecognizable to those who only knew him as the untouchable CEO. Dan's phone buzzed again, his sister this time. "Don't forget Mum's birthday dinner next week," the message read. He smiled sadly, thinking of how his mother would have reacted to this plan. She'd always told him that true character was revealed in how you treated people who could do nothing for you. Had he lost sight of that somewhere between the boardroom battles and acquisition deals? The sound of a helicopter passing overhead drew his attention back to the window. Chicago never slept, and neither did the ambitions of those who called it home. But tomorrow, Dan Christian would step away from his empire, away from the yes-men and sycophants, away from the comfortable isolation of power. Tomorrow, he would become just another face in the crowd, another dreamer trying to make it in the city that had built him and broken him and built him again. He pulled up the company's organization chart one last time, memorizing the names and faces of his future teammates. Their profiles told simple stories: mortgages, student loans, families to support. Real people with real struggles, not just numbers on a productivity report. Would they accept James Morrison into their world? Would they share their truths with him, their hopes and frustrations? Or had he been removed from ordinary life for too long to play this role convincingly? The jazz record ended, leaving Dan in silence. He walked to his bedroom, past the awards and accolades that lined the hallway. Each step felt like moving further away from the life he'd built and closer to something unknown. Excitement mingled with fear in his chest, emotions he hadn't felt since those early days of building the company. As he prepared for bed, Dan caught his reflection one final time. Tomorrow, the mask he'd worn for so long would be replaced by a different one. But perhaps somewhere between these two versions of himself, he might finally discover who he really was. The thought followed him into dreams filled with crowded elevators and forgotten passwords, of being lost in his own building, of finally finding something he didn't even know he was looking for. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was the digital clock on his nightstand, 1:43 a.m. In less than 6 hours, Dan Christian, CEO, would cease to exist, and James Morrison, junior developer, would take his first steps into a world that had become foreign to its own creator. The greatest risk he'd ever taken wasn't listed on any business prospectus or annual report. It was the risk of discovering that somewhere along his climb to the top, he'd lost something essential, something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or market share. Tomorrow would begin his greatest experiment yet, not in technology or business strategy, but in humanity itself. and for the first time in years, Dan Christian had no idea how it would end. Chapter 2. An Angel in the Storm. The Morrison Technologies cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of the lunch rush, a symphony of clattering plates and overlapping conversations. James Morrison, formerly Dan Christian just 18 hours ago, sat alone at a corner table, his untouched laptop screen reflecting the artificial brightness of the overhead lights. His stomach growled quietly, a reminder of his deliberately forgotten wallet, a calculated move in his elaborate charade. The past 7 hours had been a masterclass in humility. Gone were the deferential nods and hurried scurrying of employees making way for their CEO. Instead, James Morrison had waited in line for his security badge, endured a rushed orientation with 20 other new hires, and navigated the maze of cubicles on the 14th floor without anyone offering to guide him. He'd already been accidentally bumped into twice, had a door almost slam in his face, and experienced the peculiar invisibility of being just another face in the corporate crowd. His new team had welcomed him with the distracted courtesy of people too busy to be truly interested. Brad, his project lead, had barely looked up from his monitor while rattling off a list of protocols and repositories James needed to familiarize himself with. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd personally approved the very project he was now supposedly learning from scratch. The cafeteria had always been a point of pride for Dan Christian, CEO. He'd insisted on quality food at reasonable prices, believing well-fed employees were productive employees. Now, as James Morrison, watching people carefully counting out their cash and deliberating between options, he saw it through new eyes. The reasonable prices he'd been so proud of still added up quickly on an entry-level salary. He glanced at his phone, its screen carefully cracked, another detail in his manufactured identity, and pretended to check non-existent messages. Around him, social groups had formed and reformed, colleagues sharing lunch and laughter with the easy familiarity of daily routine. He noted how people clustered by department, by project team, by seniority, subtle hierarchies he'd never noticed from his executive floor view. That's when he first saw her. Later, he would try to capture this moment in words and fail. How do you describe the way the fluorescent light seemed to soften around her edges? How she moved through the crowded space with a grace that didn't belong in a corporate cafeteria? The way her smile, offered freely to everyone she passed, seemed to carry sunshine in its corners. Royalty. Her name badge caught the light as she walked past his table. She wore a simple navy blue dress, modest and professional, but it was her presence that commanded attention. Not the manufactured presence he'd learned in executive training, but something authentic and warm. Her natural hair was styled in neat braids, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made her standard-issue employee badge look like a royal decree. She was heading toward a table of other junior clerks when she paused, her eyes catching on his empty table space. Dan felt his heartbeat quicken. Not the nervous flutter of board presentations or million-dollar negotiations, but something more primal, more genuine. He quickly looked down at his laptop, but not before he saw her change direction. "Sugar, you look like you're having a rough first day." Her voice carried the warm, honey tones of Texas, smooth and comforting as a summer breeze. Dan looked up, carefully maintaining the slightly overwhelmed expression he'd practiced for James Morrison. "That obvious, huh?" he managed, letting a hint of genuine nervousness seep into his voice. Royalty smiled, and Dan felt something shift in his carefully constructed world. Her smile wasn't the practiced corporate gesture he'd grown used to. It reached her eyes, creating tiny crinkles at the corners that spoke of genuine warmth. "Well, you've been staring at a blank screen for 20 minutes, and I haven't seen you eat a thing." She set her lunch bag on his table and began unpacking it. "First days are hard enough with food in your stomach. Without it, darn near impossible." Before he could protest, she had placed half of her sandwich in front of him, along with an apple and a homemade cookie that filled the air with the scent of vanilla and comfort. I forgot my wallet, he admitted, the truth feeling strange on his lips after a morning of careful lies. You don't have to. Honey, my mama raised me right. Can't eat in front of someone who's hungry. She settled into the chair across from him, with the natural ease of someone who'd never learned to fear crossing social boundaries. I'm royalty, by the way. Accounting department junior clerk and today's lunch fairy godmother. Dan picked up the sandwich half. Homemade, he noted, on bread that still carried a hint of freshness. James Morrison, he replied, the fake name feeling heavy on his tongue in the face of her genuine kindness. Junior developer, apparently very bad at adulting on my first day. Her laugh was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Oh, sugar, if forgetting your wallet is the worst adulting mistake you make, you're doing just fine. Last week, I showed up wearing 2 different shoes, didn't notice until my team lead pointed it out during our morning meeting. As she spoke, Dan observed her with the careful attention to detail that had made him a successful CEO. Her nails were neatly manicured but not professionally done. She wore simple gold studs in her ears. Real gold, he could tell, but modest. A worn leather watch on her wrist spoke of sentimental value over fashion. Everything about her suggested someone who took pride in their appearance but worked within practical constraints. The sandwich is amazing, he said, and he meant it. It was a simple thing, turkey, lettuce, tomato, and a hint of mustard, but it carried the indefinable taste of food made with care. Family recipe, she said with a wink. The secret's in the way you layer it. Lettuce on both sides of the bread keeps it from getting soggy. She took a bite of her own half, and they fell into a comfortable silence. Around them, the cafeteria continued its lunchtime dance. Dan watched as other employees rushed through their meals, many eating with one hand while typing with the other. He saw the cleaning staff working efficiently around the edges of the room, nearly invisible to most occupants. From this vantage point, he could see 100 small dynamics he'd missed from his executive perspective. So, James, Royalty said, breaking into his observations, what brought you to Morrison Technologies? Besides our world-famous cafeteria, of course. Her eyes sparkled with gentle humor. Dan carefully deployed one of his prepared answers, but found himself adding unexpected truth to the fiction. I wanted something real, he said. My last job. Everything felt artificial, political. I wanted to work somewhere I could make a genuine difference. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's why I'm here too. Well, that and the dental insurance. Her joke carried an undertone of seriousness that caught his attention. But mostly because this company actually seems to care about making things better. You see that marketing campaign we're running about bringing technology to underserved communities? That's not just talk. We're actually doing it. Dan felt a surge of pride, quickly followed by humility. He'd approved that initiative, but sitting here listening to Royalty talk about it with genuine enthusiasm, he realized how disconnected he'd been from its real impact. Plus, she continued, breaking her cookie in half and offering him part without a second thought, the people here are good people. Most of them, anyway. A shadow crossed her face briefly, there and gone so quickly he almost missed it. Most of them, he prompted gently. She waved away the question with a graceful gesture. Oh, you know how it is in any big company. Office politics, little kingdoms. Nothing that can't be handled with patience and prayer. She glanced at her watch and stood, gathering her things. Speaking of which, I better head back. End-of-month reconciliations wait for no woman. Before she left, she pulled a small notepad from her purse and scribbled something on it. Here's my extension, she said, sliding the paper across to him. If you need anything, directions, advice, or just someone to have lunch with, give me a call. First weeks are always easier with a friend. Dan watched her walk away, the paper with her extension burning a hole in his consciousness. Around him, the cafeteria began to empty as lunch hour wound down, but he remained seated, turning this encounter over in his mind like a precious stone, examining it from every angle. In the past 5 years, he'd closed billion-dollar deals, spoken at global tech conferences, and been featured on the cover of Forbes. Yet somehow, this simple act of kindness, a shared lunch and a genuine smile, had affected him more deeply than any of those achievements. He carefully folded the paper with her extension number and placed it in his wallet, right behind his real driver's license. As he packed up his laptop and prepared to return to his new role, he realized that his experiment had already revealed something profound. He'd built a company that employed someone like royalty, someone who embodied the values he'd always preached in his corporate mission statements, and he'd never even known she existed. The afternoon stretched ahead of him, filled with coding tasks far beneath his actual skill level, but his mind kept returning to that smile, that laugh, that simple generosity. Dan Christian, CEO of Morrison Technologies, had just been given a priceless gift, a glimpse of his company through the eyes of someone who saw beauty in the ordinary and opportunity in every interaction. As he waited for the elevator, surrounded by employees who had no idea their CEO stood among them, Dan realized that his carefully planned experiment had just become far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Because now, for the first time in years, he wasn't just playing a role. He was truly beginning to see the world through different eyes. Chapter 3. The Test of Character. The early morning light filtered through the windows of Dan's penthouse as he reviewed the latest report from HR. From this height, Chicago looked peaceful, the morning traffic reduced to silent ribbons of movement far below. He'd been living a double life for 3 weeks now, and the strain of maintaining 2 distinct personas was beginning to take its toll. Yet he couldn't stop, not when each day revealed new truths about his company, about royalty, and about himself. His executive assistant, Margaret, cleared her throat from the doorway. "The board is concerned about the productivity metrics from the 14th floor, sir." She placed a folder on his desk with her usual precision, particularly Team B's performance on the new client portal. Dan felt a twinge of guilt, his own deliberate underperformance as James was contributing to those numbers. He'd been careful to work just below average, making enough mistakes to be believable, but not enough to be a liability. "Schedule a meeting with middle management," he replied, maintaining his CEO persona. "Let's see what challenges they're facing." The duality of his existence had never felt more acute than in these moments. Just yesterday, as James, he'd sat in a team meeting where his project lead had stressed about pressure from upper management. Now, as Dan, he was that pressure. But his attention wasn't truly on productivity metrics or management meetings. His thoughts kept drifting to the previous afternoon, when he'd witnessed something that had sparked this morning's first test. He'd seen royalty staying late, helping a struggling intern with spreadsheet formulas long after her shift had ended. The intern had been near tears, facing a deadline she couldn't meet, and royalty had simply pulled up a chair, sharing not only her expertise, but also her emergency stash of chocolate and words of encouragement. That's when Dan had formulated his plan. As CEO, he had the power to test not just royalty's technical skills, but her character itself. The first test would begin today. He picked up his phone, disguising his voice slightly as he'd practiced. "Margaret, please send a memo to accounting. I want all departmental reports reformatted according to the new template. Deadline is 5 p.m. today." He paused, then added, "And make sure it's marked as urgent from the CEO's office." The request was deliberately unreasonable. The new template was complex, and the normal turnaround time would be 3 days minimum. He knew exactly what kind of chaos this would cause in the accounting department. Hours later, as James, he watched the drama unfold from his developer's cubicle. The accounting floor was in barely controlled panic. People rushed between desks, stress evident in their hurried movements and tense conversations. He could hear fragments of complaints and worried discussions about the impossible deadline. Through it all, royalty remained an island of calm. She had immediately started working on her assigned sections, her fingers flying over the keyboard with focused precision. But what caught Dan's attention wasn't her efficiency. It was how she regularly looked up to check on her colleagues, offering quiet encouragement and practical suggestions. When Linda, from accounts payable, began to hyperventilate, royalty was there in an instant, guiding her through breathing exercises. When the printer jammed during a crucial moment, she took charge of fixing it while others continued working. She shared her pre-prepared templates, sacrificing her own advantage to help the department as a whole. During lunch, while others stress-ate at their desks, royalty organized a quick meeting in the break room. "Listen up, y'all," she said, her voice carrying that natural authority that had nothing to do with formal power. "We've got 3 hours to deadline. If we divide this smart, we can make it happen." Dan, lurking by the water cooler as James, watched in amazement as she efficiently reorganized the entire department's workflow. She identified everyone's strengths and delegated accordingly, turning a chaotic situation into a coordinated effort. It was the kind of leadership he'd paid consultants thousands to teach his executives, yet here it was, emerging naturally from a junior clerk. But the real test came at 3:30 p.m. when Janet, a senior accountant known for taking credit for others' work, approached royalty's desk. "I need your completed sections," Janet demanded. "I'll combine them with mine and send them up to the CEO's office." Dan held his breath, waiting to see how royalty would handle this obvious attempt to claim credit for her work. He watched as she looked up from her screen, meeting Janet's gaze with that quiet dignity he'd come to admire. "I appreciate the offer, Janet," she said, her Texas drawl somehow making the rejection sound like a compliment. "But I think it's important we each submit our own sections. That way, if there are any questions, we can each speak directly to our work." Janet's face darkened. "Are you questioning my authority? I've been here for 15 years. "And I respect that experience completely," royalty interrupted smoothly. "Which is why I know you understand the importance of clear accountability in financial reporting." The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it spoke volumes about royalty's character. She had stood her ground without creating an enemy, maintained her integrity without burning bridges. Dan made a mental note to look into Janet's past reports. At 4:45 p.m., royalty did something that left Dan speechless. Instead of submitting her completed sections, which he could see were ready, she began helping junior staff members who were still struggling. She could have been the first to submit, earning personal recognition, but she chose to ensure the entire department's success instead. The department made the deadline with 2 minutes to spare. As people began packing up, exhausted but relieved, Dan overheard snippets of conversation. "We couldn't have done it without royalty. Did you see how she handled Janet? Thank God she thought of using the pivot table shortcut." Later that evening, Dan sat in his CEO office, reviewing the day's submissions. Royalty's work was impeccable, despite the time she'd spent helping others. He pulled up her personnel file, noting her modest salary and the glowing but generic performance reviews. How many other hidden gems like her did his company have, he wondered, their true value obscured by hierarchical blindness? But this had been only the first test. Tomorrow, as CEO, he would implement Phase 2, a deliberate error in her paycheck, shorting her a significant amount. As James, he would watch how she handled the injustice. The thought made him uncomfortable, but he needed to know, Was her grace under pressure a facade, or did it extend to personal hardship? He stared out at the Chicago skyline, the city now alive with evening lights. In the reflection of his office windows, he caught a glimpse of himself still wearing James's clothes. He'd been too preoccupied to change after returning to his executive floor through his private elevator. The sight gave him pause. For the first time in his career, Dan Christian wasn't just evaluating an employee's performance. He was studying the content of someone's character, and with each test he planned, each challenge he would place in her path, he felt an increasing tension between his role as CEO and his growing admiration as James. His phone buzzed. A text from royalty to James. "Hope you had a better day than we did in accounting. Remember team lunch tomorrow? You're not allowed to forget your wallet this time." The simple message carried the same warmth and kindness she'd shown throughout the chaotic day. Dan found himself smiling, then caught himself. This was supposed to be a controlled experiment in human nature, in understanding his company from the ground up. He wasn't supposed to look forward to text messages or feel guilty about planned tests. Yet as he began composing tomorrow's memo, one that would deliberately challenge her position and authority within the department, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a dangerous game, not just with his company or with royalty's career, but with something far more fragile, the authentic connection that was growing between them, built on a foundation of lies. The city lights blurred as he stared into the distance, the weight of his dual identity pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new challenges, new opportunities to observe royalty's character under pressure. But tonight, in the solitude of his office, Dan Christian admitted something he'd been trying to deny. He was no longer just testing her character. He was discovering his own. Chapter 4. Falling. The autumn wind whipped around the corners of Morrison Technologies building as Dan, disguised as James, waited at their usual lunch spot. These midday meetings had become sacred over the past 6 weeks, a daily ritual that made his elaborate deception both sweeter and more painful. Today's lunch would be different, though. He'd seen the tears in Royalty's eyes that morning, when she thought no one was looking. His latest test as CEO had been particularly cruel. Her paycheck had been drastically reduced due to an accounting error, and her complaint emails had mysteriously disappeared in the system. He'd watched from afar as she'd professionally and persistently tried to resolve the issue, never losing her composure despite the growing desperation in her eyes. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he'd also discovered her secret. Late one night, after everyone had left, he'd accessed her personnel file, diving deeper than his previous cursory reviews. The truth had hit him like a physical blow. She was supporting 3 younger siblings through college, having taken on the role of family patriarch after their parents' tragic accident 2 years ago. The missing paycheck wasn't just an inconvenience. It was potentially catastrophic. She arrived at their lunch table with her usual warm smile, though he could see the strain around her eyes. "Sorry I'm a little late, sugar. You wouldn't believe the morning I've had." She began unpacking her lunch, always enough to share even now, when she had every reason to conserve resources. "Everything okay?" he asked softly, watching as she methodically arranged their impromptu feast on the table. Today it was homemade chicken soup in a thermos, cornbread that filled the air with a honeyed warmth, and 2 slightly bruised apples. She paused, and for a moment he thought she might brush off the question with her usual optimism. Instead, she surprised him. "No," she admitted quietly, "everything's not okay, but it will be. The Lord never gives us more than we can handle, even if sometimes we wish he had a little less faith in our handling capabilities." She attempted a laugh, but it caught in her throat. Dan felt the weight of his deception like a stone in his chest. As James, He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. As Dan, he knew he could fix everything with a single phone call. The duality was maddening. "Tell me," he said simply, and for the first time since they'd met, royalty truly opened up. She told him about growing up in Texas, in a small house filled with love and music, about her father, a high school music teacher who believed education was the key to everything, and her mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep that dream alive for her children. About the night 2 years ago when a drunk driver had stolen both of them, leaving royalty at 24 to become both sister and parent to 3 grieving teenagers. "Mama always said education was non-negotiable," she continued, absently stirring her soup. "So when Marcus got accepted to UT Austin, and then Jasmine to Rice, and finally little Devon to A&M, well, there was never any question. They were going somehow." She spoke about working 3 jobs while finishing her own degree, about learning to cook bulk meals that could stretch $1, about teaching herself advanced Excel to make herself more valuable in the workplace. "Landing this job at Morrison Technologies felt like a miracle," she said, her voice softening. "The salary, the benefits. I could finally breathe a little, you know." Dan knew. He'd designed those benefits packages himself, proud of how competitive they were. Now he wondered if they were enough. But this paycheck situation... She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "No, I'm not going to burden you with that. Tell me about your project instead. How's the new debugging going?" The deflection was so characteristic of her, always putting others first, always finding strength to support those around her. But today, Dan couldn't let her retreat behind that mask of perpetual optimism. "Royalty," he said gently. "You don't always have to be the strong one." Something in his voice must have reached her because suddenly there were tears rolling down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. "I'm sorry, I don't usually... It's just... Marcus needs his textbooks for next semester, and Jasmine's laptop finally died, and Devon's meal plan is running low. I've been trying to reach HR about the paycheck, but it's like shouting into a void. I know it'll get sorted eventually, but eventually doesn't help when your little brother is calling to say he's been skipping meals to make his meal plan last longer." Each word was a dagger to Dan's heart. He'd designed this test to see how she handled financial pressure, never imagining the ripple effects it would have on her family. As James, he wanted nothing more than to empty his own bank account into her hands. As Dan, he was paralyzed by the knowledge that fixing this too quickly would raise suspicions. "Let me help," he heard himself say. "I have some savings." "No." Her response was immediate and firm. "That's sweet of you, James, but I can't take your money. I'll figure something out. I always do." The strength in her voice, even now, humbled him. Here was true character, not the manufactured kind he'd learned in executive training, but the real thing, forged in adversity and tempered by love. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the soup and cornbread. Dan noticed she ate less than usual, probably stretching her groceries as far as they would go. Yet she still insisted he take one of the apples, claiming she'd brought it specifically for him. As their lunch break neared its end, she began sharing lighter stories about her siblings, how Marcus was becoming a brilliant engineer, how Jasmine was considering law school, how Devon's basketball team had made it to state finals. Her eyes lit up when she talked about them, all traces of tears replaced by fierce pride. "You know what's funny?" she said, gathering their lunch things. "When Mama and Daddy first passed, I was so angry at God for putting all this responsibility on me. But now I see it was also a gift. Those kids give me purpose, give me reason to be better every day. They're not my burden, they're my blessing." Dan watched her walk away, her head held high despite everything. In that moment, he made 2 decisions. As CEO, He would end the paycheck test immediately and implement new emergency assistance programs for employees facing family crises. And as James, he would find a way to help that didn't compromise her dignity or his cover. The afternoon passed in a blur of coding and meetings, but his mind kept returning to their conversation. That evening, in his penthouse, he drafted a new company-wide memo about employee support services. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. His phone buzzed with a text from royalty. "Thank you for listening today. Sometimes sharing a burden really does make it lighter. You're a good friend, James Morrison." Friend. The word should have pleased him. It meant his cover was working perfectly. Instead, it twisted something in his chest. Because while she had shared her true self with him today, he was still hiding behind a carefully constructed facade. He walked to his window, looking out at the city he'd conquered. Chicago's lights blurred through unshed tears as the full weight of his situation hit him. Dan Christian, the CEO who had everything, was falling in love with a woman who thought he was someone else entirely. And the cruel irony was that it wasn't his wealth or power that had captured her attention. It was his assumed identity as James, the simple developer who shared her lunch and listened to her troubles. The sound of jazz drifted through his penthouse. Miles Davis again, his father's favorite. But tonight the melancholic notes carried a different meaning. They spoke of choices and consequences, of truth and deception, of a man who had everything and nothing all at once. Tomorrow he would arrange for her paycheck issue to be resolved. Tomorrow he would find ways to make the company more supportive of employees like her. Tomorrow he would continue his careful dance of deception, watching and testing and learning. But tonight, in the solitude of his penthouse, Dan Christian admitted the truth to himself. He wasn't falling in love with royalty. He had already fallen, completely and irretrievably. And that love was built on a foundation that would eventually crumble beneath them. Chapter 5. The storm gathers. The morning fog clung to Morrison Technologies' glass tower like a shroud, matching Dan Christian's troubled mind. On his CEO desk sat not one crisis, but three. Janet's fraud investigation report highlighting suspicious patterns in their Asia-Pacific accounts, the board's demand for immediate workforce reduction, and, most alarmingly, HR's preliminary inquiry into James Morrison's employment records. But it was the fourth document that truly haunted him, royalty's community center proposal, dog-eared from countless readings. Her vision for financial education in underserved communities wasn't just ambitious, it was revolutionary. The same insight that had saved their international accounts now illuminated a path toward genuine social impact. "Sir," Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts, "Ms. Cooper is insisting on an immediate meeting about the fraud investigation, and the Shanghai office is online too about irregularities in their documentation." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with a message that made his heart skip. "James, found something in the AP accounts that doesn't add up. Remember that pattern-matching algorithm you helped me modify? It's showing something interesting. Lunch today, bringing Mama's special cornbread. Royalty." The timing couldn't have been worse. In less than an hour, he had to present the final layoff numbers to the board. As CEO, he knew the automation plans would devastate the accounting department. As James, he'd watched royalty stay late every night that week, helping colleagues optimize their processes, unknowingly fighting against her own obsolescence. The board meeting was a masterclass in corporate theater. "Gentlemen," Richard Matthews, lead director, began, "our shareholders are demanding action. These efficiency metrics from accounting." Dan barely heard the rest. Through his tablet, he watched the security feed of royalty's desk. She was explaining something to Sandra, the security guard whose wife's cancer had recently taken a turn for the worse. Even from this distance, he could read the compassion in her body language. "Dan." Matthews's voice sharpened. Are we boring you? Actually, Dan straightened, an idea forming. I think we should delay the automation timeline. There are some anomalies in our international accounts that need more delays? Matthews cut him off. The board has been more than patient with your unconventional management style lately. But patience has limits, Dan. Either you make these cuts, or we'll find someone who will. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Dan loosened his tie, remembering how just yesterday royalty had straightened James's crooked collar, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment too long. The memory made his current position feel like a betrayal. Meanwhile, Janet Cooper was building her case. Through various security feeds, Dan watched her circling royalty's desk like a shark. Interesting approach to the reconciliation, she commented, her fake sweetness barely masking her suspicion. Where exactly did you learn these techniques? Royalty's response was characteristically graceful. Oh, various places. The key is understanding the patterns in the data. Like Mama always said, money talks if you know how to listen. The morning team meeting as James was excruciating. His project lead was pushing for faster delivery timelines, unaware that their CEO sat among them, deliberately maintaining mediocre performance to avoid attention. Finally, lunch arrived. The cafeteria hummed with its usual activity, but today every conversation seemed weighted with unspoken tension. Rumors of layoffs had begun to circulate. Royalty appeared precisely at 12:30, armed with her analysis, and that promised cornbread. The sight of her, pearl earrings catching the light, natural hair styled in neat braids, smile warming the room, made Dan's guilt almost unbearable. Look at this, she spread out her findings, excitement making her Texas accent more pronounced. Everyone's focused on these transaction clusters, but they're missing the bigger picture. It's not fraud, it's actually a brilliant tax optimization strategy. The Shanghai office just isn't documenting it properly. Dan watched in amazement as she walked him through her analysis. She'd created a visualization tool that made complex international money flows clear as day. It was the kind of insight that could save the company millions. And she'd done it not for recognition or reward, but because she saw a problem that needed solving. The moment shattered with a call from her brother Marcus. Dan watched her face fall as she listened, knowing he was the cause. The scholarship check he'd deliberately delayed as another test had pushed her brother to the brink of losing his dorm room. "It's okay, baby," she soothed, though Dan could see her hands trembling. "I'll figure something out. You focus on your studies." After hanging up, she stared at her untouched cornbread before wrapping it carefully. "I should get back to work. These documentation issues won't fix themselves." The afternoon brought new complications. Elena from HR appeared in his CEO office with a thick folder. "Sir, about the James Morrison investigation. Ms. Cooper has raised some concerning points. His employment history shows—" Before she could finish, alarms blared throughout the building. A fire drill, one he hadn't authorized. Through security feeds, he watched in awe as royalty took charge. She remembered Sandra's bad knee, arranged assistance. She helped maintenance secure their supplies. Even in crisis, she thought of others first. The drill revealed more than just her leadership. As employees gathered outside, Dan observed from two perspectives, as CEO from his private viewing point, and as James among the crowd. Junior staff naturally gravitated toward royalty, seeking her calm presence. Even senior managers unconsciously deferred to her quiet authority. Janet stood apart, watching every interaction. Dan saw the moment suspicion crystallized in her expression. As employees filed back in, she made her move. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, voice dripping false sweetness. "Interesting how much time you spend with accounting. One might wonder about unauthorized information sharing." The accusation was so far from the truth that Dan almost laughed. Janet was building a case, not against CEO Dan Christian, but against the woman who had unknowingly exposed her attempted manipulation of the fraud investigation. That evening, as most employees headed home, royalty stayed late again. Dan observed her through multiple lenses: security cameras, James's casual walk-bys, and finally, a deliberately orchestrated CEO floor inspection. She was helping Devon, the night janitor's son, with his scholarship essays. The boy's writing told a story familiar to her, a family's hopes resting on education, determination forged by necessity, dreams bigger than circumstances. Her own brother's scholarship crisis lay heavy on her heart, yet here she was, lifting another family's hopes. The next morning dawned grey and cold. Layoff notifications would begin at 9. Dan arrived early as CEO, watching the sunrise paint the city in colors that felt like a mockery of the day's events. As James, he delayed his arrival, unable to bear watching the initial wave of notifications. When royalty's turn came, she entered the HR office with the same dignity she brought to everything. Her question about her siblings' insurance coverage pierced Dan's heart. Even now, her first thought was for others. What happened next demonstrated why he had fallen in love with her. Instead of returning to her desk to process her own loss, royalty spent the next hours helping shell-shocked colleagues organize their files and transition their work. She created detailed handover documents, wrote encouraging notes for her replacement, and even compiled a list of job search resources for her fellow departing employees. Her final act was the most characteristic. Using her last paycheck, she bought coffee and breakfast for the entire security team, the same team whose jobs might be next. She handed Sandra a detailed guide to navigating medical billing systems, along with a card containing her personal contact information. As the sun set on her last day, royalty packed her desk with methodical care. Each item told a story. The small plant James had given her after a particularly difficult day, now thriving under her attention. The thank you cards from countless colleagues, the family photo that had given her strength through every challenge. The security cameras caught her final moment in the building. She paused in the lobby, looking back at the place where she'd made such an impact. Her expression wasn't bitter or angry. It held something more complex: gratitude for the opportunities she'd had to help others, sadness for the dreams left unfinished, and a quiet determination that suggested this was not an ending, but a transformation. Dan watched her walk away, the weight of his deceptions crushing his chest. In trying to understand his company through elaborate tests and observations, he had lost something far more valuable: the trust of someone who embodied everything he'd claimed to value as a leader. That evening, alone in his CEO office, he stared at the city lights blurring through unshed tears. On his desk lay 4 documents: Janet's now disproven fraud allegations, the board's cost-cutting demands, his own unsigned resignation letter, and royalty's community center proposal. A vision of what might have been. The real storm, he realized, wasn't the layoffs or the fraud investigation or even his unraveling secret identity. The real storm was in his heart, where the man he'd been was dying, and the man she'd helped him become was struggling to be born. The annual gala loomed ahead, where he planned to reveal everything, but watching royalty's graceful exit, he wondered if any revelation could justify the pain his experiments had caused. Sometimes the fiercest storms leave behind not just destruction, but the seeds of transformation, if only we have the courage to nurture them. Chapter 6: Truth and Consequences. The annual Morrison Technologies Gala transformed the Chicago Grand Hotel's ballroom into a glittering showcase of success. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across the crowd of executives, developers, and support staff who rarely inhabited the same space. Tonight was meant to be a celebration of the company's highest-performing quarter to date, achieved Dan knew with bitter irony, partly through the recent layoffs. He stood on the small stage, watching his employees mingle below. The contrast between his two lives had never felt more stark. For the past 2 weeks, he'd been unable to contact royalty as James, maintaining his cover story of being reassigned to a different project. But as CEO, he'd tracked her movements, ensuring her severance package was processed quickly, watching from afar as she began interviewing at other companies. The weight of the small velvet box in his pocket reminded him of his decision. Tonight would change everything. He'd spent hours rehearsing his speech, planning every detail of the revelation. The board had been informed of his undercover experiment, though not of his personal involvement with royalty, and had surprisingly embraced it as an innovative approach to understanding company culture. Margaret, his executive assistant, appeared at his elbow. "She's here, sir." Her voice carried a note of uncertainty he'd never heard before. "Are you sure about this?" Dan turned to see royalty entering the ballroom, and his carefully prepared speech evaporated from his mind. She wore a simple blue evening gown, probably borrowed or carefully saved for special occasions, but she carried herself with the grace of a queen. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, and she wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. He remembered her mentioning them during one of their lunch conversations. The invitation to the gala had been carefully orchestrated, presented as a standard courtesy extended to recently departed employees. She'd almost declined, but the promise of networking opportunities had convinced her to attend. Even now, she was working the room with quiet dignity, making connections that might lead to new opportunities. Dan watched her through new eyes, seeing how she moved seamlessly between groups, offering genuine warmth to everyone from janitors to executives. She hadn't known she was networking with her former colleagues when she'd helped them months ago, but those connections were paying off now in introductions and recommendations. The chamber orchestra began a new piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, her favorite, another detail he'd learned during their shared lunches and coffee breaks. The music seemed to fill the space between them, heavy, with unspoken words and hidden truths. Finally, it was time. Dan approached the microphone, and the room gradually fell silent. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our financial success, but the spirit that makes Morrison Technologies unique." He spoke about innovation, about seeing problems from new perspectives, about understanding the human element in business. With each word, he moved closer to the revelation that would change everything. "6 months ago, I embarked on an experiment," he continued. "I wanted to understand our company not from the top down, but from within. So I created an alternate identity and worked alongside you as a junior developer named James Morrison." The gasps and murmurs that swept through the crowd were expected. What he hadn't expected was the look of dawning comprehension and horror on royalty's face. She stood frozen near the back of the room, one hand gripping a champagne flute so tightly he feared it might shatter. "This experiment showed me both our strengths and our weaknesses," he pressed on, though every instinct screamed at him to stop, to protect her from what was coming. "It showed me that sometimes the greatest leadership doesn't come from the executive suite, but from the quiet, everyday heroes who embody our core values without ever seeking recognition." His eyes found hers across the room. One person in particular demonstrated extraordinary character, integrity, and compassion in ways that have fundamentally changed how I view this company and my role in it. The crowd parted like water as he descended from the stage, moving toward her. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the soft strains of the orchestra and the click of his shoes on the marble floor. "Royalty," he said softly, standing before her. The name felt different on his lips now, that he spoke it in his true voice, without James's affected accent. Every test I devised, every challenge I created, you met with grace and strength I never knew existed. You showed me what real leadership looks like." She stared at him, her eyes wide with recognition and something else, betrayal. The champagne flute trembled in her hand. The missing paychecks, the impossible deadlines, even the layoff, they were all tests, he admitted, knowing each word was another nail in the coffin of her trust. "I needed to understand who you really were. What I didn't expect was to discover who I really am in the process." He reached for the velvet box in his pocket, but before he could continue, she set down her champagne flute with deliberate care. The soft clink of glass on marble seemed to echo in the silent ballroom. "Tests," she repeated, her voice carrying that gentle Texas lilt that had become so dear to him. "My siblings skipping meals, Sandra selling his wife's jewelry to make rent. All those nights I lay awake wondering how to make ends meet. Those were tests." The quiet dignity in her voice was worse than any anger could have been. Dan reached for her hand, but she took a step back. "I shared my lunch with James Morrison because Mama taught me that when you see someone hungry, you feed them. I trusted him with my dreams, my fears, my family's struggles, because he seemed to understand what it meant to work hard and still barely get by." Her voice caught slightly. "But that was all a lie, wasn't it? Every shared lunch, every conversation, every moment of trust, it was just data for your experiment." "No," he protested, his carefully planned speech forgotten. "The circumstances were orchestrated, but my feelings, our connection, that was real." She smiled then, a sad, gentle smile that broke his heart. "Mr. Christian, everything about our connection was built on a foundation of lies. You watched me struggle, let me worry about my siblings' future, all to satisfy your curiosity about how the other half lives. I want to make it right," he said desperately. "The community sent a proposal. I want to fund it. I want to create a foundation with you at the helm. I want—" "What you want," she interrupted softly, "has always been the only consideration, hasn't it? What you wanted to know, what you wanted to test, what you wanted to prove. Did you ever consider what the subjects of your experiment wanted, what they needed?" She reached up and removed her grandmother's pearls, letting them pool in her palm. "My grandmother used to say that character is what you do when no one's watching. But you were always watching, weren't you? Playing with people's lives like pieces on a chessboard, all in the name of understanding your company better." The weight of her words settled over the silent ballroom. Executives shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in her gentle condemnation. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, leaving her quiet voice to carry to every corner. "I fell in love with James Morrison," she admitted, and Dan's heart soared briefly before her next words crushed it. "I fell in love with a man who shared my struggles, who understood what it meant to work hard and still come up short. A man who listened without judging, who offered friendship without agenda. But that man never existed, did he?" She placed her name tag on the nearby table, a symbolic gesture that carried the weight of finality. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Christian, and for the lesson. I always wondered how people could have so much and still sleep at night. Now I know. They simply convince themselves that playing with other people's lives is for the greater good." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her head held high, her dignity intact. The crowd parted again, this time with a different kind of respect. She didn't hurry, didn't flee. She simply walked away from him with the same quiet grace she'd shown through every test he'd devised. The velvet box in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Inside was not just a ring, but the keys to a new community center, papers for a charitable foundation, everything he'd planned to give her along with his heart. But as he watched her disappear through the grand doors, he realized that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed with money or grand gestures. The silence in the ballroom broke into a wave of whispers. His employees, who had witnessed the entire scene, began to look at him differently. Not with the fear or respect they'd shown before, but with something new, understanding, perhaps, or pity. Dan Christian, CEO of Morrison Technologies, stood alone in a crowded room, finally understanding the true cost of his experiment. He had tested her character and proven his own lacking. He had sought to understand his company from the ground up, only to undermine its very foundation of trust. The orchestra resumed playing, but the melody now seemed hollow, empty of the warmth it had held before. The celebration continued around him, but Dan remained rooted to the spot where she had left him, holding a velvet box full of promises that would never be fulfilled, watching the space where she had been, and wondering if some prices were too high to pay for understanding. Chapter 7. The Void. 3 weeks after the gala, Dan Christian's penthouse felt like a museum of regret. Every corner held memories. The kitchen where he'd practiced making cornbread 16 times, trying to recreate her recipe. The living room where he'd spent countless nights reviewing security footage of their shared lunches. The office where he'd crafted his elaborate tests, not understanding that he was the one being tested all along. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a space that had changed subtly but significantly. Gone were the stark, minimalist decorations chosen by his interior designer. Instead, personal touches had begun to appear. Candid photos of employees he'd never noticed before, handwritten notes from team meetings, even a small potted plant like the one he'd given her as James. His executive assistant, Margaret, had watched this transformation with increasing concern. She'd served him for 8 years, through mergers and acquisitions, through triumphs and crises. She'd even helped maintain his secret during his months as James, managing his dual schedules with remarkable efficiency. But this morning something in her snapped. "For a smart man," she declared, slamming a stack of papers onto his desk, "you're being incredibly stupid." The words rang through his office like a gunshot. You tested her loyalty while lying to her face. You orchestrated hardships to evaluate her character while hiding your own. Did you really expect a different ending? Before Dan could respond, his phone buzzed. Another message from the board about the company's plummeting morale. In the weeks since the gala, the story of his deception had spread through Morrison Technologies like wildfire. Trust between management and employees had eroded to nearly nothing. Project teams that had once moved smoothly now stumbled over simple decisions, afraid to take initiative. The cafeteria, once vibrant with conversation, had become oddly silent, each table an island of whispered discussions. Even Janet, who had tried to expose his secret, walked the halls with a new wariness, as if understanding for the first time the cost of manipulation. The changes went deeper than just atmosphere. The accounting department, which had once run like a well-oiled machine under royalty's quiet influence, was in disarray. Not because of incompetence, her detailed transition documents were flawless, but because the human element she'd brought was irreplaceable. One Tuesday morning, Dan found himself wandering the building, not as CEO, but as a ghost of both his former selves. He passed Sandra's security desk, remembering how royalty had helped with his wife's medical paperwork. Sandra's wife had passed away last week, and the entire security team had attended the funeral. Something they'd learned from royalty, the importance of showing up for each other. In the break room, he overheard 2 junior developers discussing coding problems. "You know who would have known how to explain this?" one said wistfully. "That accounting clerk who used to help everyone? She made complex things seem simple." The community center proposal still sat on his desk, dog-eared from countless readings. Her passion blazed through every page, her vision for helping others so clear and compelling. He'd tried to implement parts of it through corporate channels, but without her soul behind it, the initiative felt lifeless. Late one night, Unable to sleep, he found himself in the empty cafeteria, sitting at their old lunch spot. The cleaning staff found him there, head in his hands. Maria, the night janitor whose daughter had received college application help from royalty, paused in her work. "You know what my mother always said?" she offered quietly in her accented English. "Pride is the enemy of happiness." Dan looked up, really seeing Maria for the first time. She'd worked here for 20 years, but he'd never had a real conversation with her before, another failure of perspective. "She also said," Maria continued, leaning on her mop, "that true love doesn't need tests. It proves itself every day in small ways." The words haunted him as he walked through the building that night. In every corner, he saw examples of how royalty had proved herself, not through his manufactured tests, but through genuine actions born of real character. His executive team had noticed the change in him. Gone was the decisive leader who could make tough calls without hesitation. In his place was a man who questioned every decision, wondering about its human impact, its emotional cost. During a particularly tense board meeting, his CFO finally erupted in frustration. "What happened to you, Dan? You used to understand that business is business. Now you're questioning every cost-cutting measure, every efficiency improvement." Dan stood at the boardroom window, watching the city below. A woman was sharing her lunch with a stranger on a park bench, and the simple gesture brought tears to his eyes. "Maybe," he replied quietly, "I finally learned to see the people behind the numbers." The board members exchanged concerned glances. There was already talk of bringing in a co-CEO, someone to handle the hard decisions, while Dan worked through whatever crisis of conscience had gripped him. But how could he explain that his crisis wasn't about conscience? It was about identity. He'd spent months pretending to be James Morrison, but somewhere along the way, James had become more real than Dan Christian had ever been. James had learned to see people as people, not resources. James had understood the value of a shared lunch, a kind word, a moment of genuine connection. His phone still held their text messages. Hundreds of small exchanges that revealed the man he could have been, the man she had helped him become. He read them late at night, torturing himself with evidence of their growing connection, seeing now how every response from her had been genuine while his had been calculated. One evening, Margaret entered his office without knocking, something she'd never done before. She carried a stack of newspapers and corporate reports. "Look at these," she demanded, spreading them across his desk. Each one detailed a different community initiative, a different way companies were making real differences in people's lives. If you want to prove you've changed, then change. Don't just feel guilty about what you did. Do something to make it right. The next morning, instead of going to his office, Dan walked the streets of Chicago. He saw the city through new eyes, through her eyes. He passed homeless individuals she would have stopped to help, saw struggling students she would have tutored, noticed small injustices she would have worked to correct. In the window of a small bookstore, he caught his reflection, CEO Dan Christian in his expensive suit, looking lost and alone. But beneath that surface image, he saw something else, the shadow of James Morrison, the man who had learned to see the world through eyes of compassion. The void royalty had left couldn't be filled with money or power or corporate success. But maybe, just maybe, it could be filled with purpose, with the kind of genuine concern for others that she had exemplified every day. As dawn broke over Chicago, Dan Christian made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't unsay the words that had broken her trust, but he could honor what she had taught him. He could become the kind of man who deserved the trust she had placed in James Morrison. Not for her, not to win her back, but because she had shown him a better way to live, a better way to lead, a better way to be human. And so began the long journey of transforming not just his company, but himself, of filling the void not with regret, but with purpose. Start with one small act of kindness, he remembered her saying once over lunch. That's how big changes begin. Picking up his phone, he made a call to Houston. It was time to begin. Chapter 8. The Search. The Houston heat hit Dan like a physical wall as he stepped out of his rented Honda Civic. After weeks of careful investigation, he'd traced royalty to this modest brick building in the 3rd Ward. The simple sign reading, "3rd Ward Financial Literacy Center," seemed to mock his corporate credentials. This was where real change happened, not in gleaming towers with billion-dollar budgets, but in community spaces where people helped people. He'd chosen the Civic deliberately, rejecting his usual luxury vehicles. Even his clothing was different. Gone were the bespoke suits and designer accessories. Instead, he wore khakis and a simple blue button-down, reminiscent of James Morrison's wardrobe. The transformation wasn't for show. It was an acknowledgement of how much he'd learned about true value. Through the center's windows, he could see royalty teaching a class. She stood at a whiteboard, explaining compound interest to a group of teenagers who actually looked engaged, a miracle he'd rarely achieved in corporate presentations. Her natural hair was styled in neat braids, and she wore a simple navy dress that somehow carried more dignity than any designer outfit. And that's why credit card companies love it when you only pay the minimum. Her voice carried faintly through the glass. They're not being nice. They're using compound interest against you. A student raised his hand. But Ms. Royalty, what if you don't have a choice? What if something happens and you need that money right away? Instead of dismissing the question or offering platitudes, she shared a story about her own family's struggles after losing her parents. She turned a personal tragedy into a teaching moment about emergency funds and community resources. Dan remembered her doing the same thing at Morrison Technologies, though he hadn't fully appreciated it then. He'd tracked her journey from Chicago meticulously, not through corporate investigators, but through public records and community connections. She'd used her severance package and savings, money he knew she'd intended for her siblings' education, to rent this small space. Within weeks, she'd transformed it from an abandoned storefront into a beacon of hope. Local business owners spoke of her impact with reverence. The coffee shop owner across the street described how she'd helped him restructure his loans. The elderly couple running the convenience store credited her free workshops with saving their retirement. Even the neighborhood kids knew her. She ran a homework club 3 afternoons a week. Through careful investigation, he'd also learned about her siblings' progress. Marcus was thriving in his engineering program, recently winning a prestigious internship. Jasmine had secured a scholarship for law school, her essays influenced by watching her sister's quiet strength. Devon's basketball team had made state championships, but more importantly, he was maintaining honor roll grades. A group of mothers waited in the hallway, there to pick up their children. Their conversations painted a picture of Royalty's influence. Miss Royalty helped Jerome open his first savings account. My Maria finally understands why credit card debt is so dangerous. She helped my Tommy apply for college scholarships. Did you hear she's starting a program for single mothers? Each comment was a testament to how she'd taken her own hardships and transformed them into wisdom to help others. Dan thought of all the corporate training programs he'd funded, none of which had achieved the genuine impact he witnessed here. Finally, as the last student left, clutching worksheets and looking oddly excited about financial planning, Dan gathered his courage and entered the center. The interior told its own story. Bulletin boards displayed success stories. A small library corner held financial education books, and a corner desk housed a collection of college preparation guides. Royalty was erasing the whiteboard when she sensed his presence. The marker paused mid-swipe as she turned, and for a moment he saw a flash of something in her eyes, pain, perhaps, or memory, before her professional mask slipped into place. "Mr. Christian," she said, her Texas accent slightly more pronounced than it had been in Chicago. "This is unexpected." In that moment, Dan realized how much she'd changed too. There was a new confidence in her bearing, a certainty that came from building something meaningful entirely on her own terms. She'd always been strong, but now she was also free, free from corporate constraints, free from others' expectations, free from the need to prove herself to anyone. "Royalty," he began, then stopped, all his carefully prepared speeches deserting him. Up close, he could see the subtle signs of strain around her eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders. Yet she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn him to her. "If you're here about the community center proposal," she said, turning back to the whiteboard, "you can save your breath. I'm building my own vision now, without corporate backing." The pride in her voice was tempered with something else, not bitterness exactly, but a hard-won wisdom that hurt him to hear. "I've been watching your work here," he admitted. "What you've accomplished in 2 months is remarkable." She set down the eraser and faced him fully. "Did you have someone monitoring me, Mr. Christian? Another experiment in human behavior?" The question stung, but he deserved it. "No more experiments," he said quietly. "No more tests. I just needed to see for myself that you were okay." "Okay?" She gave a soft laugh that held no humor. "I'm teaching financial literacy in a building with temperamental air conditioning, using second-hand textbooks and donated supplies. My salary is whatever's left after paying the rent and utilities. But you know what? Every day I help people understand money a little better. Every day I see hope grow in their eyes when they realize they have options they never knew existed. So yes, Mr. Christian, I'm okay." Her words painted a stark contrast between their worlds, his gleaming corporate tower in Chicago and this humble classroom in Houston. Yet somehow she was the one who seemed truly wealthy. "The company misses you," he said, then corrected himself. "I miss you." "Which you?" she asked, the question cutting to the heart of everything. "The CEO who orchestrated tests of my character, or James Morrison, who never existed at all?" Dan moved closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I've spent months trying to figure that out myself. James Morrison wasn't entirely fake. He was the person I could have been, should have been, the person you helped me become." "A person built on lies," she reminded him gently. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I won't deny that or try to justify it, but the changes you inspired in me, those were real, are real." Through the window, he could see one of her students excitedly showing a parent their first bank statement. The pride on both their faces spoke volumes about royalty's impact. "This is what I should have seen from the beginning," he continued. "Real change doesn't come from corporate experiments or character tests. It comes from people like you, who see a need and fill it, who give hope and knowledge freely, who understand that true wealth isn't about money at all." Royalty studied him for a long moment, her eyes taking in every detail of his transformation. The simpler clothes, the humbler demeanor, the absence of corporate armor he'd once worn like a second skin. "Some things money can't fix, Mr. Christian," she said finally. "Trust, once broken, is one of those things." The truth in her words hung between them like a physical presence. Through the window, the Houston sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the classroom floor. "I know," he said softly. "I'm not here to try to fix things or win you back. I needed you to know that your dream, the one you shared with James about making a difference in people's lives, it mattered. It changed me. It changed everything." She picked up her worn leather bag, the same one she'd carried in Chicago, he noticed with a pang. "If you'll excuse me, I have another class to prepare for tomorrow." "Of course." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "This isn't a proposal or a job offer. It's just something I should have done months ago." He placed the envelope on her desk and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "What you're doing here, it's extraordinary. Your parents would be proud." Her sharp intake of breath told him he'd struck a nerve, though he hadn't meant to. It was simply the truth, spoken from a heart that had finally learned to see what really mattered. As he walked back to his rental car, the Houston heat wrapped around him like a blanket of regret. Through the window, he could see royalty pick up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was not money or offers of corporate support, but something far more personal. A letter explaining every test, every manipulation, every moment of truth that had emerged from his lies. And with it, a copy of the new Morrison Technologies corporate charter, rewritten to prioritize community impact alongside profit, inspired by the lessons she'd taught him. The setting sun caught the center's worn sign, making the words financial literacy glow like a beacon of hope. Dan smiled sadly, understanding finally that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from elaborate experiments, but from simple acts of kindness over shared lunches. He drove away slowly, leaving behind not just royalty, but also the last vestiges of his old self, the man who had thought he could quantify character through tests and trials. In his rearview mirror, the community center grew smaller, but its impact on his heart only grew stronger. Some searches, he realized, end not with finding what you thought you were looking for, but with discovering what you really needed all along. Chapter 9. The letters. Every morning for 3 months, Dan Christian sat at his father's old mahogany desk in his penthouse study, pen in hand, pouring his heart onto paper. Not emails, not text messages, but handwritten letters, each one a piece of his soul laid bare on cream-colored stationery. The first letter had been the hardest. His hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than crafting personal correspondence, had trembled as he wrote, "Dear Royalty, I've written this opening 100 times in my head, and nothing seems right. How do you begin to apologize for betraying someone's trust so completely? How do you find words for regret this deep?" He wrote about his childhood, about losing his parents at 16 and inheriting a crumbling company at 22, about building walls of wealth and power to protect himself from ever feeling vulnerable again, about how her simple act of sharing a sandwich had cracked those walls in ways he'd never expected. Each morning brought a new letter, a new confession, a new truth revealed. Day 15. Today, I walked through the cafeteria and saw our old lunch spot. Remember when you taught me how to properly layer a sandwich to keep it from getting soggy? Such a small thing, but it was the first time in years anyone had taught me anything without an agenda. I miss those lessons, not just about sandwiches, but about life, about what really matters. Day 27. I visited the security desk today. Sandra's wife's medical bills have been paid anonymously. Not by me. I know now that throwing money at problems isn't always the answer. But I've started a company-wide healthcare review, looking at how we can better support families during medical crises. You taught me that true leadership means seeing the human cost of every policy decision. Day 42. The board thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. Today I proposed converting our empty 5th floor into a free daycare center for employees. It's the kind of idea that would have seemed ridiculous to the old Dan Christian. But I remember how you juggled supporting your siblings while working full-time, and suddenly it seems like the only sensible solution. He wrote about the changes her influence had sparked in him and in the company, about the new employee assistance programs, the revised layoff policies that prioritized retraining over termination, the community outreach initiatives that went beyond mere tax write-offs. Day 63. Today, I sat in on new employee orientation. Not as CEO, not undercover, just as myself. I listened to their hopes and fears, their dreams and struggles. One young woman reminded me of you. Same determination in her eyes, same desire to make a difference. I didn't test her character or question her motives. Instead, I remembered how you taught by example and tried to do the same. Some letters were harder to write than others. On day 75, his pen hovered over the paper for hours before he could admit, "The truth is, I fell in love with you long before I planned the grand revelation at the gala. It happened quietly, over shared lunches and coffee breaks, through watching you help others even when you were struggling yourself. But I was too caught up in my experiment, too afraid of losing control, to admit what was happening. By the time I realized the depth of my feelings, I'd already trapped myself in a web of lies." He wrote about sleepless nights spent replaying their conversations, about the emptiness of his success without her wisdom to ground it, about the lessons that continued to unfold from their time together. Day 89. "I understand now what you meant about wealth being relative. My net worth hasn't changed, but I feel poorer without our conversations, richer when I help others the way you always did. The company's charitable foundation has been restructured. Every initiative now requires direct community involvement, not just financial support. We're not just writing checks anymore. We're building relationships." There were lighter moments too. On day 91, he shared, "You'll appreciate this. I tried making cornbread using your recipe today, set off every smoke alarm in the penthouse. Even my failures remind me of you, of how you turned every mistake into a learning opportunity, though I doubt even you could find a teaching moment in what emerged from my oven." As the letters progressed, they became less about apology and more about growth, less about regret and more about transformation. Day 98. The cleaning staff now joins us for management meetings when we discuss building operations. Maria's suggestion about adjusting the night shift schedule has improved efficiency by 30%. But more importantly, people feel heard. You taught me that every voice matters, that true wisdom often comes from unexpected sources. He wrote about the changes in his leadership style, how he'd learned to listen more and command less, about the way he now walked through the company, not as a CEO observing his domain, but as a member of a community. The final letter, written exactly 3 months after his visit to Houston, was different from all the others. "Dear Royalty, this will be my last letter, not because I've run out of things to say, but because I finally understand something vital. Words, no matter how heartfelt, are not enough. You taught me that actions speak louder than any explanation or apology. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to plead for a second chance. Instead, I want to thank you. Thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. Thank you for teaching me that true character isn't revealed through tests, but through daily choices. Thank you for helping me become not a better CEO, but a better person. The company has changed because you changed me. Every policy revision, every new initiative, every improvement in how we treat our people, it all stems from the lessons you taught James Morrison, lessons that Dan Christian needed to learn. Your community center in Houston is doing amazing work. I know because I've heard the stories, seen the impact, witnessed the hope you're creating, not through surveillance or reports, but through the proud parents and grateful students who share their experiences online. You're building something beautiful there, something more meaningful than any corporate success I've ever achieved. I won't send you any more letters after this, but I want you to know that your influence continues to ripple outward, touching lives you've never met, creating change you never intended. You taught me that real power isn't about control or authority. It's about empowering others to reach their full potential. The man you knew as James Morrison never existed, but the growth he experienced was real. The lessons you taught him live on in every decision I make, every policy I implement, every life we touch as a company. You once shared your sandwich with a stranger because your mama taught you to help those in need. That simple act of kindness set in motion changes you never could have imagined. I hope that somehow, knowing this brings you some measure of peace. With deepest gratitude, Dan. He sealed the final letter with the same care he'd given everyone before it, adding it to the thick stack in his desk drawer. Whether they would ever reach their intended recipient remained uncertain, but their true purpose had already been served. Through the act of writing them, of examining his actions and their consequences, of acknowledging his failures and commemorating his growth, Dan Christian had finally begun to unite the best parts of both his identities. The morning sun streamed through his study window, catching the edge of his father's old desk, where 92 letters lay waiting, each one a step on the journey from who he had been to who he was becoming. Outside, Chicago was waking up, its people beginning another day of hopes and struggles, dreams and disappointments. Dan picked up his pen one last time, not to write another letter, but to sign a new company policy, one that would ensure no employee ever had to choose between education and opportunity, between family and career. It wasn't a grand gesture meant to win back what he'd lost, but a quiet acknowledgement of lessons learned and wisdom gained through the simple act of sharing lunch with someone who saw the world differently than he did. The letters might never be sent, might never be read, but their impact would be felt in every life touched by the changes they had inspired. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful words are the ones we write not to be forgiven, but to ensure we never forget the cost of our mistakes and the value of the lessons they teach us. Chapter 10. 3 Conditions. The late autumn rain drummed against the windows of Dan's Chicago office as he read and reread the email that had arrived that morning. After 3 months of letters, after all the changes and growth, after accepting that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt, royalty had finally responded. Her message was characteristically direct. "Mr. Christian, I've read your letters, all of them. Each morning I would find one waiting in my mailbox at the center, and each evening I would tell myself not to open it. But I did. Every single one. If you're serious about making amends, I have 3 conditions, not demands, not tests, just requirements for moving forward. Meet me at the Houston Center next Monday at 9 a.m. if you wish to hear them." Royalty. The week that followed was both the longest and shortest of Dan's life. He threw himself into preparation, not knowing what to expect, but determined to be ready for anything. The board was notified of his impending absence, though he didn't specify for how long. His executive team was empowered to handle daily operations. Everything was in place for him to step away if necessary. Monday morning found him outside the 3rd Ward Financial Literacy Center an hour early, watching the Houston sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope. He'd driven himself in another rented Honda Civic, maintaining the humility he'd learned to value. The center looked different in the early morning light, more vibrant somehow, as if reflecting the purpose it now served in the community. At precisely 9 a.m., he walked through the doors. The interior had evolved since his last visit. New computers lined one wall, donated by local businesses. The bulletin board overflowed with success stories, college acceptance letters, new job announcements, first home purchase celebrations. This was what real impact looked like, not quarterly reports and stock prices, but lives transformed one lesson at a time. Royalty was waiting in her classroom, grading papers with the same focused attention she'd once given to accounting reports. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not quite warmth, but not the cold distance of their last encounter either. "You came," she said simply, setting down her red pen. "I would have crawled here if necessary," he replied honestly. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. A student's desk, he noticed, not the power position he was accustomed to. Another lesson in humility. "My first condition," she began without preamble, her Texas accent somehow stronger, more grounded, is that you volunteer here at the center for 6 months, not as a CEO, not as a consultant, but as a regular person. You'll teach basic financial literacy classes, help students with their college applications, and work alongside our other volunteers. Dan nodded, already mentally rearranging his schedule. You won't be using your connections or your wealth, she continued. You'll work with the same resources and constraints we all face here. You'll learn what it really means to make a difference without the power of a corporate checkbook behind you. Her second condition came with a slight softening of her expression. You will establish a foundation to support education for underprivileged youth, but I will be an equal partner in its management, not an employee. Every decision will be made jointly. Every initiative will require both our approvals. This isn't about your redemption or my forgiveness. It's about creating real, sustainable change in communities that need it. Dan felt his heart rate increase. This was more than he'd dared to hope for. A chance to work alongside her again, to blend his resources with her vision. And the third condition, he asked quietly. Royalty stood and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood she'd chosen to serve. When she turned back to him, her eyes held both strength and vulnerability. You will never again wear a mask with me, metaphorically or otherwise. No more tests, no more experiments, no more carefully constructed personas. I need to know that every word, every action, every moment is genuine. I'm not asking for perfection, Dan. I'm asking for truth. The use of his first name, not Mr. Christian, not James, sent a shiver through him. This was the moment of choice, of committing to absolute honesty no matter the cost. These aren't punishments, she added softly. They're opportunities. Opportunities to prove to both of us that the growth you wrote about in those letters is real. Dan stood slowly, maintaining the respectful distance between them. And if I meet these conditions, then we start over, she replied. Not as CEO and employee, not as teacher and student, but as equals. Two people trying to make a difference in the world, learning from each other along the way. The morning light filtered through the classroom windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, making them dance like possibilities in the air between them. When do I start? He asked. A ghost of her old smile touched her lips. Right now. The advanced Excel class starts in 20 minutes, and their regular teacher called in sick. Show me what you really know about spreadsheets, Mr. CEO. The next 6 months would test him in ways no board meeting or corporate negotiation ever had. He would learn the names and stories of every student who came through the center's doors. He would understand the real challenges of teaching financial literacy to those who had never seen financial security. He would experience the frustration of working within tight budgets and limited resources. But more importantly, he would learn to see the world through new eyes, not through the mask of James Morrison or the facade of CEO Dan Christian, but through the authentic perspective of a man discovering his true purpose. The foundation planning would begin after hours, when the day's classes were done. They would sit in her small office, sharing ideas and visions, sometimes arguing, sometimes agreeing, but always moving forward with shared purpose. Her practical wisdom would temper his grand plans. His resources would help expand her reach. And through it all, every day, every moment, he would practice the hardest condition of all: absolute authenticity. No more calculated responses, no more strategic revelations, just truth in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. The morning classes began to arrive, adults seeking better financial futures, teenagers dreaming of college, small business owners wanting to understand their options. Royalty handed him a worn textbook and a dry erase marker. Remember, she said softly as she headed for the door, these people aren't test subjects or potential customers. They're human beings with hopes and fears and dreams. Treat them accordingly. As Dan turned to face his first class, he realized that her three conditions weren't just requirements for potential reconciliation. They were a blueprint for redemption, a pathway to becoming the person he'd glimpsed in those shared lunches so long ago. The next 6 months would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But standing there, marker in hand, watching royalty slip into the back of the classroom to observe his first lesson, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Every condition, every challenge, every moment of vulnerability would be worth it. Not because it might lead to her forgiveness, but because it would lead him to something he'd been searching for all along. His authentic self, the person worthy of the trust she might one day place in him again. Chapter 11. Redemption. Through sweltering Houston summer days, Dan worked alongside royalty at the Third Ward Financial Literacy Center. The air conditioning struggled against the Texas heat, and his carefully pressed shirts soon gave way to more practical attire. Gone were the power suits and designer watches. In their place, rolled-up sleeves and a $10 timepiece that kept better hours with the rhythm of the center than his Swiss chronometer ever had. His first week teaching had been humbling. Despite his years of financial expertise, he discovered that explaining compound interest to a single mother working 3 jobs required a different kind of wisdom altogether. His corporate presentations had never prepared him for the raw honesty of students who challenged every assumption about financial stability he'd taken for granted. But Mr. Dan, 16-year-old Marcus, no relation to royalty's brother, but carrying the same fire in his eyes, had asked, "What's the point of saving when every emergency wipes out whatever you've put aside?" The question had stopped him cold. His rehearsed answers about long-term planning and compound growth seemed hollow in the face of such immediate reality. It was royalty who stepped in, sharing her own story of struggling to support her siblings, of finding creative ways to stretch every dollar. "Sometimes," she'd explained, "saving isn't about getting rich. It's about buying yourself choices when life gets hard." That moment became the first of many lessons, not just for his students, but for Dan himself. Each day brought new understanding, new challenges, new opportunities to prove the authenticity of his transformation. The foundation work progressed in evening sessions, where they sat across from each other in her small office, surrounded by grant proposals and community needs assessments. True to her condition, every decision was made jointly. He learned to listen when she pushed back against his grander ideas, understanding now that sustainable change often came through small, consistent efforts rather than dramatic gestures. "We need a computer lab," he'd suggested one evening, already reaching for his checkbook. "No," she'd said firmly. "We need partnerships with local businesses to provide internships. Computers are tools, but relationships build futures." Her wisdom, earned through real experience rather than business school theories, repeatedly proved more valuable than his corporate instincts. The foundation they were building together became something neither of them could have created alone. A blend of his resources and her practical understanding of community needs. 3 months into his time at the center, crisis struck. Their oldest student, Mr. Johnson, suffered a heart attack. His medical bills threatened to derail not just his own financial stability, but his daughter's college plans. The old Dan Christian would have simply written a check. The new Dan had to find a different way. He spent nights working with local healthcare advocates, learning about assistance programs, negotiating with hospital billing departments, not as a CEO, but as a concerned community member. Royalty watched his efforts without commenting, but he caught the slight nod of approval when he finally presented Mr. Johnson with a manageable payment plan and scholarship information for his daughter. "You didn't just solve his problem," she said later. "You taught him how to navigate the system." That's the difference between charity and empowerment. The summer heat gave way to fall, and Dan found himself more invested in his students' success than he'd ever been in corporate profits. He celebrated when young Marcus opened his first savings account, shared Mrs. Rodriguez's tears when she qualified for a small business loan, and spent extra hours helping Mr. Johnson's daughter perfect her college essays. His own transformation became evident in subtle ways. The board of Morrison Technologies noticed that his video conference contributions had changed. He asked different questions now, considered different metrics of success. The Foundation's initiatives reflected this evolution, focusing on sustainable community development rather than quick fixes. One particularly challenging day, when the center's ancient printer had broken down before a crucial workshop, Dan found himself in an office supply store, carefully counting out cash from his modest teacher's stipend rather than pulling out his corporate card. The experience taught him more about budgeting than any MBA course ever had. Royalty observed his struggles and successes with careful attention. She corrected his teaching techniques when necessary, supported his innovative approaches when appropriate, but never once softened the boundaries she'd established. Their relationship remained strictly professional, though tinged with a growing mutual respect. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, 4 months into his tenure at the center. A young girl, no more than 17, had stayed after class, clearly troubled. Dan was preparing to refer her to Royalty, as he did with most sensitive situations, when the girl spoke. "My dad lost his job," she said quietly. "He's too proud to ask for help, but I heard him crying last night. I don't know what to do." Instead of offering solutions or platitudes, Dan found himself sharing the story of his own father's struggles, of the pride that had nearly cost them everything, of the lessons he'd learned about asking for help. The girl listened, really listened, and for the first time, Dan understood what Royalty had meant about authentic connections. Later that evening, as they reviewed the day's events, Royalty finally asked the question that had lingered between them for months. "Why are you really here, Dan? And don't tell me it's about making amends or meeting conditions. What's the truth?" He considered his answer carefully, honoring her requirement for complete authenticity. "I'm here because this is where I learn who I really am," he said finally. "Not as a CEO, not as James Morrison, but as someone who can actually make a difference in people's lives. Every day here teaches me something I should have known but didn't, about money, about people, about myself." She studied him for a long moment before responding. "And what have you learned about yourself?" "That I was wrong about almost everything," he admitted. "I thought leadership was about control, about testing people's character, about maintaining power. But real leadership, the kind you show every day, is about empowering others to find their own strength." The printer whirred in the background, spitting out worksheets for tomorrow's classes. Through the window, the Houston sunset painted the sky in shades of possibility. They sat in comfortable silence, the distance between them still present, but somehow less insurmountable. As month 5 began, Dan noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. Royalty began asking his opinion more often, not just about foundation matters, but about student situations. She shared her own challenges more openly, allowing him to see the weight she carried as the center's heart and soul. Their evening planning sessions grew longer, not because the work required it, but because their conversations deepened. They discussed educational theory, social justice, the real meaning of financial literacy in communities that had been systematically excluded from traditional financial systems. One night, working late on a particularly challenging grant proposal, she finally asked about the letters. "Why did you write them? Really?" Dan set down his pen, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "At first, it was about explaining myself, maybe even justifying my actions. But somewhere along the way, they became something else, a daily reminder of who I want to be, of the lessons you taught me, of the person I glimpsed in those moments when I wasn't hiding behind any mask." She nodded slowly. "I kept them all, you know." even the one about the cornbread disaster. The slight smile that accompanied this revelation felt like sunrise after a long night. As his 6 months drew to a close, Dan realized that royalty's conditions hadn't been about punishment or penance. They had been about transformation, not just of his actions, but of his understanding of what truly mattered in life. The foundation they'd built together was thriving, its programs shaped by real community needs rather than corporate metrics. The center had expanded its reach, not through grand gestures, but through careful, sustainable growth. And Dan Christian, CEO of Morrison Technologies, had learned more about true wealth from teaching basic budgeting skills than he had in years of managing billions. On his last official day as a volunteer teacher, his students surprised him with a handmade card. Inside, each had written what they'd learned from him, but it was the last message, in Mr. Johnson's shaky handwriting, that brought tears to his eyes. "You taught us that it's never too late to learn, to change, to become who you're meant to be." As he packed up his modest desk, Dan realized that royalty's 3 conditions had given him something far more valuable than a chance at redemption. They had given him the opportunity to earn what no amount of money could buy: authenticity, purpose, and the hope of becoming someone worthy of not just her trust, but his own. Chapter 12. Full Circle. 1 year to the day after their first meeting, Dan Christian sat alone in the Morrison Technologies cafeteria at the same corner table where royalty had once shared her sandwich with a stranger. The busy lunch hour buzzed around him, but this time he wasn't pretending to be someone else. He was simply a man, waiting, hoping, and holding a simple brown paper bag. Inside was a sandwich, carefully crafted according to her instructions from so long ago, lettuce on both sides of the bread to prevent sogginess. He'd made it himself, after countless practice attempts, determined to get it right. Beside it sat a single cookie, slightly imperfect, but made with the same recipe her mother had passed down to her, which she'd once shared with him during their countless lunch breaks. The past 6 months at the Houston Center had changed everything. He'd completed her conditions not just in letter, but in spirit, learning lessons about humility, authenticity, and true service that no amount of corporate success could teach. The foundation they'd built together was transforming lives across multiple communities, guided by her wisdom and fueled by his resources. But more importantly, he'd changed. The masks were gone. Both the CEO's polished facade and James Morrison's constructed humility. What remained was simply Dan, a man who had learned that real strength comes not from power or position, but from the courage to be authentically yourself. Royalty had relocated to Chicago permanently to co-direct their foundation, working from the Morrison Technologies building but maintaining her independence. They had settled into a professional rhythm, their shared passion for helping others bridging the gap their past had created. But something remained unspoken between them, something that needed this moment to finally be expressed. The cafeteria doors opened, and she appeared. Her natural hair was styled elegantly, and she wore a simple blue dress that spoke of confidence rather than status. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and time seemed to fold back on itself, bringing them back to that first fateful meeting. She approached his table, and he felt the same nervous flutter he'd experienced that day, though now it came from a place of genuine emotion rather than calculated deception. "Is this seat taken?" she asked softly, her Texas accent warming his heart. "I've been saving it," he replied, "for someone who once taught me the right way to make a sandwich." She sat down, and he carefully unpacked the lunch he'd prepared. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized the care he'd taken to recreate that first shared meal. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remember everything," he said. "Every lesson, every kindness, every moment of truth you showed me when I was hiding behind lies." He handed her half of the sandwich, just as she had done for him a year ago. "Royalty," he began, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm not asking for anything. You've given me more than I deserve already, the chance to learn, to grow, to become someone better. But I want you to know that I never fell in love with you as James Morrison or as CEO Dan Christian. I fell in love with you as myself, through every genuine moment that slipped past my masks." She took a small bite of the sandwich, and tears welled in her eyes. "You layered it perfectly," she said with a trembling smile. "I had an excellent teacher," he replied. "Someone who showed me that the simplest acts of kindness can change a person's life forever." Royalty set down the sandwich and reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Do you know what I fell in love with?" she asked quietly. "Not James Morrison's struggles or Dan Christian's power, but the glimpses of real truth I saw in both of them. The man who truly listened when others spoke, who cared enough to remember small details, who wanted to make a difference but didn't know how until someone showed him that real change starts with one simple act of kindness." They sat there, hands clasped across the table, as the busy cafeteria continued its daily rhythm around them. In that moment, they were neither CEO and employee, nor teacher and student, but simply two people who had found their way back to each other through a journey of truth and transformation. "I have one more condition," she said, her eyes twinkling with both mischief and tenderness. "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Promise me that no matter what titles we hold, what success we achieve, or what challenges we face, we'll meet here for lunch once a week. Just us, sharing a sandwich and remembering where our story began." Dan felt his heart swell with love and gratitude. "I promise," he said, "as long as you teach me how to make that cornbread of yours. I think I've finally mastered sandwiches, but my cornbread still sets off smoke alarms." Her laugh, warm and genuine, filled the space between them, healing the last remnants of past hurts. She squeezed his hand gently and said, "Deal. But first, tell me honestly, did you really make this cookie using Mama's recipe?" "Attempted would be a better word," he admitted with a grin. "It took 7 tries, and I'm pretty sure my housekeeper is still finding flour in unexpected places." "Well then," she said, breaking the cookie in half and offering him a piece, just as she had done so many times before, "I guess we'll just have to keep practicing together." As they shared their simple lunch in the corporate cafeteria, they both understood that their story had come full circle. Trust, once broken, had been rebuilt stronger than before. Love, tested by truth, had endured and deepened, and two people who began their journey behind masks had finally found the courage to be genuinely, authentically themselves. Their wedding invitation, sent out months later, would carry a simple message that captured the essence of their journey. Love doesn't ask for credentials. It asks for courage to be yourself and kindness to accept others as they are. Please join us in celebrating a love that began with a shared sandwich and grew into a shared life. And in the years that followed, employees at Morrison Technologies would often see their CEO and the foundation's director sharing lunch at that same corner table, sometimes laughing, sometimes in deep discussion, but always with a sandwich cut in half between them. A simple reminder that the greatest love stories don't begin with grand gestures, but with small acts of kindness that change lives forever. Subscribe if you liked.